What's going on, everybody? Cleepus Tech here, coming back at you with another video. In this video, I'm going to be giving you my first impressions of the Cricket Magic 5G. Now, as always, if you do end up wanting to learn more about it, definitely check out the description, where I will be linking to several other videos about this device as I make them, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. But with that being said, let's get into it. So with the Cricket Magic 5G, first of all, this is an extremely affordable phone, going for around $139 full price. And honestly, with the deals Cricket usually offers, even if you're not porting your number over or anything like that, you still typically can get some sort of deal. So chances are you're probably not going to pay full price for it. So the bottom line here is, if you are planning on switching to Cricket and you're looking for a really affordable phone, then the Cricket Magic 5G definitely does check that box because, again, at $139 full price, let alone whatever you might get with the deal, this is definitely a really cheap phone. Now, despite being on the cheaper side, we are getting a pretty decent display here. With the Cricket Magic 5G, we're getting a 6.6-inch 90Hz IPS LCD display with a 720p resolution, a PPI of 286, and a 20:9 aspect ratio. Now, on one hand, at this point, at pretty much the end of 2023, I usually don't really care for 720p displays, but considering really how affordable this phone is, I honestly don't mind it, and really, if you look at it, for what it is, it doesn't look that bad. So if you're watching the occasional video every now and then, or maybe using social media or something like that, I do think it will be at least okay. And in general, the display is decently bright, the colors look pretty good, and with the 90Hz refresh rate compared to your standard 60Hz display, the movement on the screen is going to be a bit faster and smoother, making the phone feel a bit more premium to use. So in general, despite not having the most amazing display, I do think, again, for what it is, it does look pretty decent. So considering that, I really have no complaints. And then when it comes to size and dimensions, honestly, this is kind of the same no matter what phone you get, whether you get a super low-end one or a really high-end one, it doesn't really matter. At this point in 2023, most phones are going to be around 6.5 inches, give or take, and the Cricket Magic 5G is really no exception. But that being said, I do think this is a good size for a display, because on one hand, it's not too large to the point where it's uncomfortable to put in your pocket, but on the other hand, it definitely is large enough to the point where if you're maybe doing a lot of reading or something like that, you still will get a good experience. So in general, if you're looking for a super affordable phone, but you also want to make sure you have a decently good display, then this phone will be a pretty good choice. Now for storage, with the Cricket Magic 5G, we're getting 64GB of internal storage with microSD card expansion. So on one hand, not insanely impressive, but on the other hand, for what it is, the storage is pretty decent here. So as long as you're not really like a power user, I feel like for the average person getting a phone like this, 64GB will be plenty of storage. And again, it does support microSD card expansion too, so if you have a lot of photos and videos, for example, you can always offload that stuff onto a microSD card, and this will make a difference. Now for security features, the Cricket Magic 5G does have Face Unlock and a fingerprint scanner right here on the back, so definitely nice to get both options. On one hand, it's not really rare per se, but specifically in this price range, sometimes they only have one or the other, and sometimes even neither, although that was more a thing maybe in 2021 or 2022. At this point in 2023, it's really rare that a phone doesn't have either a fingerprint scanner or Face Unlock, but regardless, the flexibility is always nice, so whichever one you want to use, you can really choose here. But real quick, let's give the fingerprint scanner a try. There we go, one more time. And there we go. I really like that animation there. You don't really see that very often, especially in lower end phones like this. And surprisingly, it doesn't really do anything to the performance, so definitely a nice cool touch. But aside from that, as you saw, the fingerprint scanner does work really well. No issues at all, so definitely great to see there. Now for the camera setup, with the Cricket Magic 5G, up front, we got a typical water drop notch for the selfie camera. On one hand, the hole punch would have looked a lot better, but this is Cricket. I seriously doubt they're ever gonna really change this design, so it really doesn't look too bad. Now this camera is 5 megapixels, then on the back, we got a dual camera setup with a 13 megapixel main camera and a 2 megapixel macro camera. So pretty much the exact same setup as the Cricket Innovate E5G, which despite Cricket still technically offering that phone, I feel like this is really going to be replacing that, so not really surprising that not a whole lot has changed. But keep in mind, if you are looking for a camera that has a bit more in the way of features, you will be disappointed here, because unfortunately there's no ultra wide camera or macro camera, which at this point in 2023, even for really low end phones, I kind of expect at least a macro camera. But it is what it is, and of course, this is a really affordable phone, so you can only really expect so much. Now, considering this is a first impressions video, I haven't actually used the camera yet. In fact, as you can see here, I haven't even taken this little film off here. I actually just opened the box like 20 minutes ago, but regardless, based on what I know from the Cricket Innovate E5G, which again, I do think this phone is basically that phone's successor, considering they are really similar, despite not being particularly impressive. When it comes to these entry-level 5G phones you can get from Cricket, the cameras are actually a lot better than they might seem, so even though it only has a regular 13 megapixel main camera, which is really nothing special, especially at this point in 2023. I am expecting the photo quality to be at least decently good enough for something like Instagram, for example. So if you're not really a super heavy camera user, but you still want to get an occasional presentable photo every now and then, it's not like you won't be able to do that, so definitely keep this in mind. And another thing I do want to point out, and I really just noticed this, but with the Cricket Magic 5G, for video you actually can record in up to 2K in both the rear and front cameras, so that is a really nice surprise. In fact, even compared to phones that are honestly a lot higher end than this. I'm not saying the video quality is going to be absolutely amazing, but when it comes to the resolution, there are phones that are like double the price or more. They can only record in 1080p, and while 2K of course is not 4K, it still is a little better than 1080p, so I will give it that. So if you are someone who likes to record a lot of videos, maybe not for a professional kind of thing, but maybe just for fun, but you want to get a really good video quality, compared to most other phones like this, the Cricket Magic 5G will have an advantage. Now for the RAM and processor, with the Cricket Magic 5G, we're getting 4GB of RAM with the MediaTek Dimensity 700 processor. Now I was a little disappointed here because, let's be real, the MediaTek Dimensity 700 is pretty old at this point, but to be fair, I mean, it is a pretty decently good processor, and I guess the logic behind this is, if it still works, then why replace it? So for what it is, I do think the processor will at least get the job done, but keep in mind it has been around for a while, so it's not like anything we haven't seen before. In fact, the Cricket Innovate E5G and the Cricket Dream 5G, which both came before this, they all have the same processor, so if you currently have one of those phones and you're planning on upgrading, then I wouldn't get this phone just because it's essentially going to be about the same. But again, to be fair, the MediaTek Dimensity 700 is not a bad processor for what it is, and for more basic daily activities, if you're doing stuff like web browsing, social media, streaming content like videos and music, and even some light mobile gaming, it will at least get the job done. Now I ran a benchmark test on this phone using Geekbench 6, and here are the results I got. Now I do recommend running this test on your current phone, and then comparing your results to these, and that's going to give you a better idea of where this phone stands performance-wise compared to your current device. And again, it's Geekbench 6, but again, in general, I feel like for the average user looking for a more entry-level phone, the performance here is plenty good enough. I mean, to do something like browse Instagram or Google searches and stuff like that, you really don't need a super fast phone, so for more light users, it definitely will get the job done. But if you are someone who's really going to be on your phone a lot, maybe doing more demanding activities like high performance mobile gaming and things like that, you will probably want to get something higher end and faster, and especially if you're coming from maybe an older but higher end device, in that kind of situation your expectations will probably be a bit higher, so if that's you, I would definitely avoid this phone. But if you do kind of have an idea of what to expect from more of a low-end phone like this, then I do think you will be pleasantly surprised, because in my limited experience so far, this phone's performance has been pretty good. Now for the battery, I wasn't really too impressed, but with the Cricket Magic 5G, we are getting a 4000 mAh battery. So yeah, not the largest battery out there, and the reason I really point this out is because at this point in 2023, I feel like pretty much every phone has a 5000 mAh battery, and although there are some exceptions like flagship phones for example, for the most part, if you're looking for an entry-level 5G phone and you really want a great battery, there's so many options that this phone having a 4000 mAh battery is definitely a disadvantage. Honestly, I feel like the only way they can even get away with this is because it's so cheap that, again, you can really only expect so much. So I do get it, and in addition to this, in my experience so far, the battery life has been pretty decent. I mean, we're at 45% now at 100% brightness because I don't like to keep my phone dim. And in general, based on just my first impressions, the battery has been performing pretty well, so we'll see how it goes. But just keep in mind, if you really want an insanely good battery, you are going to want to get something else. But if you're okay with more of an average battery, maybe you're just really not a heavy user, or maybe you spend a good amount of time around a charger, in that case, despite of course not being the best out there, the battery on this phone will be at least okay. Now for the software, with the Cricket Magic 5G, we are getting Android 13, and One thing I do want to point out about this is that despite definitely not being outdated right now, when it comes to carrier branded phones like this, I don't typically expect any major updates, so if you were hoping to get Android 14 with this phone, then you will be disappointed, but if you're really only after a decently new software that runs pretty well, then I do think it will be okay here. When it comes to other features, the Cricket Magic 5G does have NFC, and in case you don't know, NFC is basically the main technology behind Tap and Pay, so if you do like to use Tap and Pay, then definitely keep in mind, you can use it with this phone no problem. So definitely a nice thing to see. I know maybe a couple years ago, most lower end phones didn't have NFC, but at this point in late 2023 going into 2024, I am expecting pretty much every new phone to have it because after all, it's been around for so long, it's in all the stores at this point, pretty much. It's really an expectation for a smartphone to have it, so definitely great to see here. Now, taking a look at the phone itself, despite not really looking or feeling premium in any way, I do actually like the design here. For what it is, I feel like it's super thin, and despite this, again, we are getting a 6.6-inch display, so it's not exactly small, but at the same time, it is really comfortable to hold, and it will fit in most pockets nicely. That being said though, keep in mind the phone is pretty much made entirely of plastic except the display that's glass, but every display is made of glass, so that's kind of a given. But in general, because it's made of plastic and because the plastic is a little bit more on the cheap side, I would definitely recommend getting a case for this because if you drop this on like concrete or something, it's not going to do nearly as well as some of the higher end phones that have metal frames and glass backs, so definitely keep this in mind. But even with a case, I don't think it's going to be too bulky or anything, so for an entry level phone like this, I really have no complaints when it comes to the design. Now on the left side here, we got the slot for the SIM card and the micro SD card. On the bottom, we got the microphone, USB-C port, and the speaker. Don't worry, there is a headphone jack right up here at the top, next to the noise canceling microphone. On the right side, we got the power key, volume down, volume up. On the back, we got the fingerprint scanner, camera module, flash, and Cricket branding. So all in all, definitely a decently nice looking phone. So again, when it comes to the design, I really have no complaints. But in conclusion, my overall first impressions of the Cricket Magic 5G. Now, on one hand, if you compare this to like a $300 phone, obviously this is gonna feel pretty cheap and kind of disappointing. And if you have something like the Cricket Innovate E5G, for example, and you're expecting this phone to be a really good upgrade, then again, in that situation, you will be disappointed. But at the same time, I do think for what it is, being a phone you can get for significantly under $200, this is honestly a pretty solid device. Sure, it doesn't have a super fancy display, a bunch of camera features, lightning fast performance, or a crazy good battery, but at the same time, everything is at least decent. I mean, the display looks good enough for the occasional YouTube video or maybe browsing the web or using social media. The performance, again, is fast enough for what it is. The camera, although I haven't personally used it yet, I know it's gonna take at least decent photos, and the battery life is at least okay too. And again, I really do appreciate that this phone does have NFC because while I do honestly consider it an expectation at this point, there's still many phones that are quite a bit more expensive than this, that came out recently for that matter, that still don't have NFC. So in general, if you're looking for an affordable 5G phone for more basic activities, then based on my first impressions so far, I definitely think the Cricket Magic 5G is worth considering. Now once again, if you want to learn more about this phone, definitely check out the description, where we'll be linking to several other videos about it, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. But that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it and found it useful, be sure to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to follow Kalipis Tech on Twitter and Instagram. And as always, I will see you in the next video.